One of the most devastating consequences of trauma is the way that it can affect someone's brain. Now, as we've heard in the series, trauma affects all areas of the brain. But right now, we're going to do a deep dive into how trauma impacts the brain's three major networks. So that's the default mode network, the salience network, and the executive network. Let's start with the default mode network.
So the default mode network is the major resting state network of the brain. So when you're at rest, when you're just idling, like a car in neutral, this is the brain network that's most active.
So even when we're at rest, the brain is still active. This makes trauma's impact on the default mode network even more important than we may have once thought. So to understand more clearly how trauma affects this specific brain network, let's dig deeper into its parts. The default mode network is composed of three brain regions.
One is called the posterior cingulate cortex, which is at the back of the brain, sort of in the middle. And that's an area that helps us to figure out what's self-relevant and not. And again, we can, think about our trauma patients who often don't know what's self-relevant, right? For example, if somebody was raped in a forest and then goes back to a forest years later, they may think they're going to be raped again because they think the forest is self-relevant, even though it isn't at all. Then the second part of the default mode network is called the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex, and that's an area of the brain at the front in the middle. And that's an area of the brain that really helps us to know what we feel. So it helps us to know our internal emotional life. So really to figure out what's going on emotionally inside. And again, when we think about our trauma clients, they have great difficulty from doing that, right? They're very much disconnected from their internal emotional life. And then the third area of the brain that's part of the default mode network is in the parietal cortex up here, the lateral parietal cortex. And that part of the brain really allows us to have an embodied sense of ourselves in space. And again, when we think about our traumatized clients, often they don't know where their body starts and where their body ends, right? Because they're so disconnected from their own body and how their body relates to the environment.
These three parts are most active when the brain is at rest. When the brain is engaged in thinking or planning, these three areas are quiet. And when someone experiences trauma early in life, these three areas get so disrupted that they don't connect at all. And this disconnection can often have major implications for at least some of our clients.
And so one thought is that, the disruption in the default mode network may be very important in the disruption of the sense of self, often seen as a result of trauma.
You see, Ruth and her colleagues hypothesized that this brain network may give us a window into a client's sense of self. And when trauma disconnects this network, it can have a significant impact on how our clients understand themselves.
The whole function of this network is engaging in self-reflective function, so figuring out what's self-relevant, knowing our internal emotional life. And so I think it really reflects the fact that our patients aren't able to do this very often. So if you don't know what you're experiencing, emotionally, if you're disconnected from your body, if you don't know where your body begins and ends, if you can't, recall memories appropriately, if you can't look into the future, your sense of self is going to be very much affected, right? And we know that trauma very much affects the sense of self.
To get a better read on just how much trauma impacts the default mode network, Ruth and her colleagues looked into how this brain system develops in the first place. So perhaps the first thing to note is that it develops over time, and it isn't fully developed until late adolescence. The second thing to note is what this network looks like in an adult who experiences trauma in childhood.
What we found was that the default network of chronically traumatized people in childhood actually looks like the default network of a 7 to 9-year-old. So it's possible that, chronic childhood trauma and abuse really affects the development of this network.
So trauma can damage the default mode network significantly, and this can give rise to a number of difficulties for anyone who's experienced childhood trauma. Let's look at two issues in particular.
Emotions at the time of trauma were useless, and it didn't matter whether they wanted to run away or whether they were angry and they wanted to fight. Those emotions were useless, so they disconnected really from their inner emotional life. And I think this is reflected in the disconnection of the default mode network. So I think that's one area of disruption. The second difficulty is really recalling past memories, past autobiographical memories, so memories of yourself. And the third area of difficulty is future-oriented thinking, so not being able to see yourself in the future.
Overall, these disruptions can wreak havoc on a person's ability to build a sense of self.
And having a sense of self really depends on seeing yourself in context with the past and with the future. And the default mode network is also very important in recalling memories of your life and looking into the future. And I think not having the proper connections in the default mode network really prevents yourself from seeing yourself in context with the past and with the future. And so I think it affects, higher areas of consciousness and your sense of self, because in order to have a strong sense of self rooted in the present, you really have to see yourself in the context with the past and with the future.
Okay, so now that we've covered the default mode network in depth, let's move on to the executive network. Like the default mode network, this network is also adversely impacted by trauma.
The central executive network is in the upper part of the brain, and it contains the front part of the brain and the parietal cortex part of the brain. And it's an area of the brain that's absolutely critical in helping us think, helping us plan. It's really important in short-term memory, so remembering phone numbers, remembering names, and it's really important in helping us sustain attention, so really focusing on something.
So what does damage to the central executive network look like in our traumatized clients?
They can't sustain attention, they have huge difficulties with short-term memory, and planning is often difficult for them as well. So the more a person dissociates or zones out and is not present, the less able to function that central executive network seems to be.
So what can we do to determine if our client has problems with their central executive network?
And so I think that's something to be really aware of when we take a history is, how much is the person dissociating? So asking them, do you lose chunks of time? Do you zone out? Do you have difficulty being in the present? And then asking them about central executive network functions, such as how's your short-term memory? How's your ability to focus? How's your ability to plan?
Now finally, the third network of the brain is the salience network.
So the salience network is a really important network in the brain that helps us to figure out what's most important both in the environment but also internally. And then that helps us to guide our behavior. So for example, if I decide what's most important right now is that there's a guy standing there who's about to break into my house, all my behaviors will be guided towards, getting myself into safety. So the salience network is really important in that. It includes the amygdala, which is part of the emotional part of the brain. It also includes the anterior cingulate cortex that modulates, heart rate responses, and also figures out, whether there's errors that we have to sort out. And also the insula is part of the salience network, and that part of the brain really helps us to be aware of what we feel inside.
When a person experiences trauma, the salience network can go offline. Now that can happen in two different ways.
When we're really hyper-aroused and really hyper-vigilant, the salience network can actually be overactive. But the salience network can also be underactive. So when we disconnect and when we numb out, the salience network can actually be underactive.
So our task is often to balance this network and find the client's optimum window of tolerance, where the client isn't too revved up or too dulled down. Ruth has experience with this in her own work. Here she shares the story of a client whose salience network was way out of balance.
So, for example, I had a person once who was always hypervigilant. She always thought at any second she would be attacked. And so I think, her salience network was going crazy because, she was incredibly hypervigilant to the point of being paranoid. But, as we discovered, she didn't disclose this right away, was her perpetrator was still very much in her life, and the perpetrator was her father. And he was coming to her house, driving by, dropping things off. And at first she was too ashamed to disclose this.
Once the client shared that the threat was still very real for her, Ruth was able to help her explore ways to create more safety.
Once she was able to disclose that this was still happening in her life, we developed some plans that could help resolve this issue. And, one was putting a restraining order against, her past perpetrator. And so she was able to do that. It took obviously a number of months because she had this victim-perpetrator relationship with her father. Her knowing that, if he were to come by her house, he would be arrested. And you could see, her level of hypervigilance and her salience network just kind of relaxing and calming down because, her whole life situation now had changed, right? She no longer needed to be hypervigilant all the time because, he was no longer in her life.
After taking steps to exercise control, Ruth's client was able to begin restoring the broken connections in the salience network, that part of her brain that's involved in understanding her environment and her own behavior. So the default mode network, the executive network, and the salience network, we've now seen how trauma impacts all three of these brain systems. But we've also looked at some effective ways to work with the damage. So I hope you've heard something here that's useful to you and that you can use in your work with your clients. Thanks for watching.